Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Collective Impact Forum, I'd like to welcome you to today's online training, Moving from Vision to Implementation, Strategies for Systems Change and Collective Impact. My name is Robert Albright, Director of Programs with the Collective Impact Forum. We have a terrific program for you today with some great speakers, and this online training has been adapted from a session at our 2017 Collective Impact convening last May due to its popularity with attendees. Before we get started, I want to touch on just a few quick items. Today's program is 90 minutes long, and we encourage you to stay engaged throughout. We will ask you to reference a separate reflection worksheet at several points during today's training, so please have that worksheet available. If you didn't download the materials in advance, which were shared via email to all pre-registered attendees, you can download today's presentation slides and that worksheet real-time by clicking on the Click here to download your handout box on the right side of your screen. We'd like to start by asking you a quick poll question, and the question is, how many people are watching today's webinar at your location? You should see that pop up on your screen. We encourage attendees to organize viewing parties for today's webinar, so while some of you may be watching this at your own desk, we know some people are sitting together, so I will pause for just a moment while you select a number of attendees at your location. You should see those results coming in real time, so we'll just give it maybe 5 to 10 more seconds. Great. Thanks for putting up that poll. So a little over 55% of you are individually watching it, but it's great to see multiple people from organizations and partners watching this together. Just a couple other real quick logistical points. So other than polls, we want to hear your questions and comments, so you can submit them at any time during the presentation via the white box on the right side of your screen. The presenters will pause to respond to as many questions as possible. At several points during the training, I'll be keeping an eye on the questions that come through, and we'll make sure to play those back to the presenters, and we'll mention your name, whoever poses the question as we have time. So if you want your questions or comments to be anonymous, just mention anonymous when you type in your Q&A. We also encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag Collective Impact, and if you need technical assistance during the webinar, you can email customer support at Blue Sky eLearn at the email address on the screen at support@blueskyeLearn.com. As a reminder, please click on the download your handout box again on the right side of your screen. This will be important because we're going to ask you to reference a separate reflection worksheet at several points during the online training. So please do have that worksheet readily available. And then lastly, this event is being recorded, and you will receive the recording link to your email after the conclusion of today's webinar. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. And the last thing I'll say, just as a quick thanks and introduction, I wanted to introduce the 3 speakers and presenters for today's online training. So Melissa Oomer is Associate Director at FSG. Amber Parker is Program Manager of Operation Youth Success, a collective impact effort focused on juvenile justice system reform in Omaha, Nebraska. And Lauren Smith is Managing Director at FSG and Head of FSG's U.S. Health Practice. And Lauren will take it away from here. Lauren?
Great. Thanks, Robert. Really excited to be here with you all, and it's wonderful that so many people are joining. So let me just jump in and say, give you a sense of what the overall agenda is. We're going to be talking about the common agenda and what the components are and how that can be helpful to you in your work. We're going to be talking about the structures and focusing on work groups. How do you select them, and how do you sort of ensure that they're working effectively? And then we're really excited to be hearing a story from Omaha with our colleague Amber, and then we'll be having some final Q&A and discussion. So we have a full agenda for you. So here we are. So you have to imagine yourself, and for many of you, it's not really going to be imagination because you're deep in the work. You've got a steering committee, and you're making progress. You're building relationships. You're developing a shared understanding of the problem. And you may even have decided on what kind of big, bold goal that you're going to go after. So then your question undoubtedly has to be, now what? How do we move ahead? You've got all of these committed, talented people in one place, and you need to figure out how are you going to get everyone pulling in the same direction toward the same goal. And so part of that is what we want to dive into a little bit here in terms of making up or developing a common agenda. So there's really several elements, 5 that we're going to talk briefly about today, that go into making an effective common agenda. The first are the principles that you're going to use and how you work together. So this is going to be an important touchstone, or these will be an important touchstone that you're going to come back to. If you hit a bump in the road that requires, sorting out a problem or a dilemma and how you proceed, what kind of decision you're going to be making, this is going to be where you come back to say, all right, what did we agree together were going to guide us when we got to these situations? Second is going to be problem definition, right? You certainly can't tackle everything at once. Whatever problem or issue or area you want to dive into, undoubtedly it has a complex and multifaceted parts. So what's going to be inside the scope of what you're going to attend to, and what's going to be outside? Not forever, but maybe just at least initially. The third is, in terms of goal, is how are you going to know when you're heading in the right direction? How are you going to measure or define movement towards success? Next is a framework for change, and that's really when you get into the meat of the work. How are you going to organize it so that it's manageable? How are you going to divide it into digestible chunks so that you can be sure that you can actually make headway and get work done? And then lastly is a plan for learning. This is often left out and can really be a very important missing link, because this has to do with how you're going to take what you're learning along the way in the work that you're doing and use it to correct or adjust your course, rather than waiting to the end and saying, hey, why didn't that work out? Do you have a plan in place to bring that learning in as you're going to ensure that you can adjust and correct along the way? So to start off, to go in a little bit more detail in terms of guiding principles, we're going to use as an example a collaborative multi-sector effort in South Texas that's focused on diabetes, just as an example. And so when you're thinking about guiding principles, you really are setting up how you're going to act towards each other. What's going to be the environment and tone that you want to set? What are your shared values? The rules. What are your rules of engagement? So this particular group in Texas, as an illustration, identified these 4 as really being key to how they wanted to work together. They wanted to be thinking about the whole community using a systems-oriented approach. They really wanted to start from a place of assets as opposed to focusing on what was wrong. They wanted to start with what was right in the community and how they could build on that. They really wanted to acknowledge and emphasize that it was a shared effort and that everyone had some responsibility in moving towards success, and they wanted to focus on making sure that the community members and individuals felt empowered to act on their own behalf. So when they get stuck, and I would say not necessarily if, but when, because inevitably, some bumps are encountered. When you get stuck, you can come back to these and ask, how are these principles at work in the problems that we're wrestling with? How would we respond if this is in fact what we want to hold ourselves accountable to? In terms of defining the problem, so here is this, back to this issue about what are unique aspects of the issue or problem that you're considering in your area, and how are you going to consider what is included, and very importantly, what is not going to be included, at least for now, and how you're going to be moving ahead. So for this example, the team in Texas decided that although there was an entire spectrum of a continuum of issues related to diabetes, from those individuals at risk for diabetes to those who have what's called pre-diabetes, to those who have diagnosed diabetes and those who have uncontrolled diabetes or with serious outcomes or complications. So this group decided that although there was a whole spectrum, they couldn't do it all, and they really decided, hey, we want to be working and focusing more upstream on those folks who are at risk for diabetes and those who have pre-diabetes. So whatever the issue is that you're looking at, there will be some way of dividing it or identifying a manageable portion to start with. This doesn't mean that you won't get to some of these other things or that they're not important, but just saying you're choosing to start your work here. In terms of setting your goal, This part is really about choosing a goal that can be measured, and that will be inspiring to others and make people feel like it's important to come along. And also to be sure that there's considerations or thinking about issues of equity that are included there. And you can see the example of this group, Unidos contra Diabetes, and how they approach that in terms of reducing the number of cases, giving themselves 5 years to do it initially, so that they could have a noticeable and marked reduction in a set time frame. So next, I want to just move on to thinking about the building the framework for change. So here, you're going to have to think about prioritizing the strategies you want to work on first. What do you think is going to have the most impact, or the impact that you can most readily achieve? What's generating change or likely to generate change based on your understanding of the issues and the problems and the context and the work that's already happening in your areas? And then, you're going to divide up your work into chunks or sort of sections that will be able to be addressed or sort of tackled by your working groups. And Melissa is going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but in this case, these folks decided that they wanted to focus on awareness, screening, intervention programs, and then integration of the medical system with community and other resources, and then lastly, to have the data that would inform policy. So that's how they decided to organize their work into groups that were going to be geared to action. It's important here to recognize that there's you could take any one issue, like, for example, this diabetes issue, and you could have come up with, another set of working groups. So there's no right answer. It's just that people have to agree that, yes, this seems reasonable for now and want to go forward. It's really important, and we're going to come back to this again, to be sure that community voice and community participation is included in all of this. Otherwise, it's not going to be relevant to or include, really important perspectives. How to plan for learning. So here we're talking about the considerations here are about, again, how do you incorporate what you're learning, the lessons that are coming to the fore as you're going, so you don't have to wait to the end to be able to look back retrospectively and say, gee, I wish I had done something differently, or that we had tried to do a course correction earlier. There are going to be some kinds of change that are going to be easier to see or will be achieved sooner. So, recognize that the pace of change will be different, and you're going to probably be identifying different kinds of things that can be expected to have impact over different time frames. In this example, here are the working groups we were just talking about, and they identified that if it works, the working group's impact will be through changing health behaviors and leading to a healthier community that would then have decreased risk factors and overall, ultimately, the ultimate goal of decreased diabetes. So they incorporated a way of bringing learning back from all those different sort of sections back into the work to ensure that they're learning as they go. So I want to, we've alluded to the idea of incorporating engagement in communities earlier, but I think it's really important that we delve into that just a little bit more because community engagement really is an essential component of achieving the impact that you're all looking to achieve. So there's multiple reasons why working groups should engage in the community, and again, we probably could have come up with 5 other ones because there's so many. But these are just a few to start with if you need some conversation starters with your group. So let me just say that a couple things. One is these slides will be available, so we don't have to go over all of them now, but just recognize that they're going to be available, and you can be sure to look at them in addition. So let me just move on to the next slide and go through a little bit some of the stages or levels of intensity of stakeholder engagement that you may have been experimenting with. So the process of developing the elements of a common agenda can and should engage the community. These different levels of intensity will really help you figure out where are you acting and how might you adjust. So the first level is to inform. Essentially, that's a one-way information sharing where you provide the public with important information, but you're really not asking for input. You're just sort of giving information in one way. Next would be consult, which would be you are trying to get input and feedback from folks. The next level would be involve, and that's, again, a little bit higher level where you're working directly with stakeholders, you're trying to understand their concerns and their issues, and you have a dialogue. In collaboration, you really are, it's a deeper level of partnership, and there's participation in every aspect of decision-making, including the development of alternatives and priorities. So here you're not just involving people and asking for feedback, but you're giving control and according responsibility to those that you're partnering with. And then lastly, when you co-lead, you're really agreeing to place the final decision-making in the hands of everyone, which means, there's some power that will have to be given up, which can be sometimes uncomfortable and unusual for folks. But this kind of co-lead is really a truly shared partnership, and so that's something to consider. And so what I'd like to do now really is just take a moment and have you all consider across this spectrum where are you currently working, and recognizing again that if we were to go back to the reasons for engaging in the community, we included things like making sure that we understood the community challenges, that the solutions were co-created, and to make sure that we understood that we're moving in the right direction and that we've prioritized the right things, as an example. So let's move here, and I wanted to just take a moment and let you have just a few minutes, probably, 5 minutes or so, to look at the worksheet. Again, be sure to download your worksheet. You can click that button, click here to download if you haven't already done so. And you'll see that the document is called From Vision to Implementation Webinar Worksheet, and it's Worksheet 1, Creating a Common Agenda. So with everything that we've just sort of gone over pretty quickly, I wanted to give you just, maybe 5 to 7 minutes of time to start filling out this worksheet, recognizing that as you begin to consider this work, you don't need to finish it right now. This is just a start. Consider this as a conversation starter, and you might consider following up and working on this as a group exercise with your coalition or collaborative partners. So we're going to take a moment. You're going to hear some music as you have an opportunity to look at your handout and start jotting down ideas. If you haven't already, you can click on the click here to download your handout button to the right side of your screen. Hi, everyone. Thank you for doing your good work and initial brainstorming. You have about a couple minutes left. Just want to give you a heads up. So, again, don't feel like you have to get it all down now. This is just a start and to kind of whet your appetite for this. So you'll hear a little bit more hold music, and then we'll come back on to move on. But you have a couple more minutes. Thank you. All right, then. Thank you all so much for jumping in, and I see some questions that are coming in to the chat box, which is great. So one question is about how do you define community? I was talking about community engagement, and there's a really great question about how do you define it. This person writes that stakeholders could include government, scientists, NGOs, business leaders, fishermen and their communities, or fishermen and their families rather. And we could say that all of them are part of the community, or we could say that just fishermen and families are part of the community. What do we mean? Great question, and I think that back to the principles here is coming to a shared understanding of what that means. So when we talk about community engagement, I think, I would need to really start and say part of what the group has to do is come together and figure out and decide and agree on who the community is and how that's going to be defined. That's part of the scoping of the issue and part of those principles that we talked about at the beginning. So that's a really good question. Let me move on and just quickly ask you a quick poll, which is of the common agenda elements that we were discussing earlier, which has been the most challenging for you? Principles, problem definition, defining a goal, developing a framework for change, or creating a plan for learning. So take a moment or two to fill in. We've got a number of, almost 130 folks on. So let's see if we can make sure to give enough time for folks to weigh in. It looks to me like building a framework for change is definitely the winner, which is really interesting. It looks like principles and problem definition and developing a goal, like those are easier for folks. But now the framework of change, developing a framework of change is the hardest. So got it. Thanks for sharing that. All right. Our next poll is around your current community engagement. So we were just talking about what the different levels of intensity of community engagement, all the way from simply informing folks, that is just letting people know what's happening, all the way up to co-leading. So what we'd like to know now is, what are you currently using? Where are you in this spectrum right now? I'm also getting some notes that I understand that there's some people that might be having difficulties hearing, which means you might not be able to hear me now. But I know that the Blue Sky folks are working on that. So it seems like most people are somewhere kind of in the middle here, with a lot of folks identifying that they're on a collaboration level, with some folks more on consult and involve. The fewest, not surprisingly, are in the co-lead. That's pretty hard to get there. Like I said, there's a lot of conditions that have to be met to get there. So this is really important to see. So the bulk of you are collaborate, with some of you sort of evenly spread out there between inform, consult, and evolve. All right, for our next poll, and again, I apologize for the issue with the audio, but hopefully everyone can hear me now. We're wanting to know, where do you think you need to be? So not what you're doing now, but where would you hope to be in the future? And thinking about how would you like to, what's your goal in terms of your level of community engagement? All right, we see it coming in. All right, it's interesting that, there's no right or wrong answer here. There's a spectrum of level of intensity, but it seems like people really do want to be moving more to the level of collaboration and ultimately to co-leading, which is interesting and important to know. And so then that sets up yourself and your group to have questions about, how do we get there? What will it take to be comfortable in placing decision making in the hands of stakeholders and in sharing that responsibility and that authority? So thank you for sharing. All right. Now we're going to have a few moments to think about what we've just talked about, so the twin themes of how do you develop a common agenda, those components we were talking about, and it seems like that developing that framework for change, folks acknowledge were particularly tricky, and then thinking about anything related to community engagement. So we're going to have a few minutes for questions.
Great, Lauren. Thanks. This is Robert. I'll jump back in. We've been keeping track of some great questions that have come through, so I'll play this back to you, but Melissa or Amber, feel free to jump in as well. So one question that came up, a person asked him, I am new to working in collective impact. What are some success factors for getting agreement, particularly if you're in the earlier stages of collective impact?
Oh, great question, right? And I think that underlying there is the idea of, wanting to develop or wanting to achieve some, what people might refer to as quick wins, so that you can gain momentum and give people a sense that, movement is possible, and that there are rewards for working together. Robert, what would you add?
That was something I was thinking about as well, is getting some early wins, some early momentum. I think the other thing that it comes to mind for me, oftentimes we see initiatives that are successful on the front end, if they actually build in the time on the front end for going deep on relationship building and building trust. And it's less technical, but it is some of the soft elements that are often really important before you dive deep into content. So we've seen initiatives do things to really get at kind of what are people bringing to the meeting that gets them excited, and then pairing that up with what does the data show that are the greatest kind of issues or challenges in the community. I find that pairing up kind of how you build trust with how you analyze the qualitative and quantitative data is super important.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think people have that adage about, change happens at the speed of trust, and couldn't agree more that taking the time up front to build the relationships. And sometimes that can be frustrating for folks who want to, move quickly to, achieve, a big impact as soon as possible. But building in that time for trust and relationship development is really important.
So one other question that came through, and this might relate to the importance of trust, but it gets back to the spectrum and some of the poll questions. This was a question from Christy Gabbard from Virginia, asking about the conditions of co-leading. So talk a little bit more about the kind of far right side of the spectrum. How have you seen that play out in your work?
Yeah, great question. And as I said there, it can be hard to get there because it does require folks being perhaps working in a new or different way in terms of sharing the responsibility and authority and power, frankly. So there's no way to get to co-leading without that trust building that we were just talking about, because you can imagine that you're in a what will be a long-term relationship. You have to really have built mutual trust and mutual respect and understanding of the value that the other is bringing to the conversation. I think that's what's really an important condition there, Robert, is that all parties authentically value that the others have insights, perspectives, and assets that they're bringing, and that's a really important condition. I don't know,
Melissa. Thanks, Lorna.
Melissa or Amber want to jump in there.
Yeah, we can share a little bit about how that happened in Omaha. So we'll be giving you a little bit more context for this work, but it was focused on juvenile justice. And how we saw this kind of evolve at the beginning of the initiative was through specific structures. So the parents and youth who were involved with juvenile justice had never been actually involved in a reform effort or a change effort. It was very top-down in the past. And so we created two structures to embed them within the Collective Impact Initiative, one through a working group around parent empowerment, which fostered a lot of dialogue between parents who have experienced the system and those, professionals who are working in the system every day, like school resource officers, probation officers, and attorneys. So that really had a lot of interesting conversations about how they were experiencing the same processes or different parts of the system in very different ways. And the other way we got input on the common agenda early on was that we had a very specific youth council that was set up of formerly or currently involved youth, either in both the child welfare and juvenile justice system or just the juvenile justice system. So they gave feedback on just the language and the way this should be run. Now, there were some challenges to how do you get those youth to these meetings, compensate them for their time, et cetera. So that has evolved, that actual council doesn't exist as a separate entity, but now Operation Youth Success has tapped into other kind of coalitions of youth through nonprofit partners that they work with. And Amber, if there's anything else you want to add there, feel free.
I think you covered it so far.
Great. Thanks for your perspectives on that. We've got time for a couple more questions now. We've got plenty to get through now, and we'll have some more time at the end as well. But let's definitely take some time for a couple more here. A question that came up about specific. Just looking at who had asked this question. Oh, Shiloh, our colleague and friend in Cincinnati. So Shiloh asked, do you have any tools or resources to help a community decide which area to work on a collective impact initiative if there are multiple issue areas that would potentially benefit from collective impact? So any thoughts on, Melissa or Lauren, if you've seen that play out in communities that you've worked in where they're trying to look at multiple issue areas, or Amber, your thoughts on how you all approach that in Omaha?
I'll take just a super quick. I mean, part of this has to be with, it's based on where the energy is and where are the folks that are particularly sort of fired up to be focusing on something. So you'll know some of it about that. You're going to certainly have data and understanding of how the issues are trending, how they're experienced, if their concentration in different neighborhoods or regions or areas. And I think it's really important to also look at what's happening in the rest of the region or the area to know, what might be real ripe for movement. But I'll pause.
Yeah, I can add a little bit more. So in addition to those things of kind of a sense of urgency around the issue, as Lauren said, as well as people who are willing to be champions for it, in addition to that, there needs to be obviously funding available locally or brought from national funders to support this type of work, as well as really a history of collaboration. So something that we often find that is overlooked is, there's a lot of disconnects and silos in the system, and that means a collective impact approach is needed, but you kind of have to make sure before you fully launch into this, are people ready to come to the table with kind of a new mentality, a new spirit of collaboration. And so that is something that's obviously very difficult to measure, but can be kind of gauged through various conversations.
And Robert, you have a readiness assessment tool on that you could send people to, right?
We do, and I'll keep a running list as we're talking about other tools or resources. I know people are always hungry for concrete tools that you can use. So for those of you who are earlier in your work, we do have a readiness assessment. You can think about whether your community has the leadership and the urgency and some of the resources and some of the things we'd like to see. There's also an adapted version that's more of a progress assessment check that for those of you who are in the mid to late stages, so already implementing the work, to reflect on where you are in the work. We've got a lot of questions on community engagement, but I want to maybe take one more now that's on a different thread, but related to this, how you move from vision to implementation, and then we can come back to some of these other rich questions on the community engagement front later on in the conversation. So this question that came up is, since different strategies require different coordinated actions, how do you develop work plans that show how everyone's actions will combine to reach the goals, and how do you monitor and coordinate them? So I guess you could think about this as like getting a level deeper under that kind of framework for change. Let's say you started to divide up the work. How do you make sure that you're coordinating across, and doing that in a way that goes beyond just coordinating through meetings, which people can get worn out from?
Wow, great question, and so accurate and perceptive, and chances are it sounds like this person posing the question has experienced this. I think there's probably a couple things. One is you really, this is one of the reasons that having a backbone organization or entity that can serve that role is so important, and not what and obviously different kinds of organizations can do that, but to have someone whose job it is to really focus on and think about the kind of coordination you're talking about, and develop the platform to do that, so you can bring that back and show people how things are connected. And people don't have time on their nights and weekends to do it, but if it's someone else's job to bring that and knit that together, that's really, really important in terms of those meshed work plans and that sort of thing. I wonder, though, Amber and Melissa, if you're going to talk about this at all in your sections.
I don't have anything as specific in my remarks. Amber, I don't know if there's anything, since you are kind of managing lots of different work groups, if there's anything top of mind that's kept you kind of organized, or if you'll talk about that when you dive into the details of your working groups.
Well, I think that it's certainly important for each work group, to draw out and draft their own individual work plan that has action items on it, and each action item is assigned to someone specifically in the work plan, or a group of people might be assigned to it, a little subcommittee sometimes it takes to move certain low-hanging fruit items forward. But then obviously one of the things that we find very important is to have those regular check-ins with the co-chairs to make sure that we're setting up each work group meeting, planning for that, bringing together the resources in preparation for the meeting, and having a lot of email communication with our work group members. Like you mentioned, it is not the co-chairs or the work group members' full-time job to do this work, but that is the full-time job of the backbone. So we really see ourselves as the support behind the work groups. If not for them at the table, we cannot accomplish any of the goals. So we are the work behind the scenes, whether it be building the resources, finding the tools that are necessary to drive the work forward, and then really equipping those members to have the easiest possible path to achieving their goals, and keeping those friendly reminders about the meetings as we prepare for them to come each week or each month. Lots of communication, though. That is what the backbone does. That is our role, is to support everyone at the table, because we know that they have just a small piece of this, each of them, and for us, it's what we get paid to do. So we are, staff support for sure.
Thanks, Amber. I appreciate you jumping in on that. And that was definitely a specific question that Cal had asked from Michigan about, describing the backbone role. And I know you'll come back to that a little bit later as you describe more of your work and how your work is played out in Omaha, so we can dig into that one in a little bit more detail. I'm thinking maybe for the sake of time, I want to make sure we get through the other parts of the presentation. We do have another good block of time for Q&A at the end, so do please keep your questions coming. We've got a couple that we were able to get to now, but we'll have more time at the end. So with that, I think it might be good to transition on. I'll pass it to you, Melissa, to take us through the next section of the conversation, and then we'll come back to more questions soon.
Great. Thank you, Robert. So I'm so excited to talk to you all about working groups. This is my favorite part of collective impact work. It is also the hardest. But as Lauren and Amber and Robert have all alluded to, this is really where all the action happens. These working groups are able to kind of really fill gaps and address barriers in the system beyond all the individual programs that participate in them. And when done right, they're really powerful. So we're going to dive into, what exactly are working groups, what are their responsibilities, and how do they achieve change. So for the visual learners that we have today, this is a picture of what the different structures of collective impact actually look like. Today, what we're going to be diving really deeply into is the right-hand side of the page, the working groups. So these are made up of frontline managers and practitioners who are working on the issue at hand every day. And usually they're not asked to really drive or catalyze systems change. A typical change effort is going to be very top-down. But you see this visual is not drawn in a top-down way. It's actually side to side. So on the left-hand side, you have the steering committee made up of all the different leaders of a system. And then you have the backbone playing the role that Amber just described, coordinating everything. But on the right-hand side, you have the working groups really doing a lot of the work with the support of steering committees and members and a backbone, but they're not driving it per se. The working groups are really empowered to make decisions and determine how to prioritize the different strategies of the initiative. So what do working groups actually do? They have three big responsibilities. The first is to drive the strategy, as I was just describing. So the steering committee and the backbone, along with community input, may set a broad common agenda, but working groups are really going to set priorities within their part of the framework for change. And they're going to monitor what they're doing and adjust as they go and make sure they're looking at data to see if things are working or not. The second thing that they do is actually implement. These are not new programs. These are things that require coordination across the actors around the table, new studies and understanding of the system, really enhancing services that already exist. And so a lot of times that means that work group members are actually participating hands-on in doing some of those things. And as they're doing it, again, they're learning and refining as they go to see how things might need to change or if things are ready to scale up in a bigger way. So that's where a lot of the action is. And then the third area is just more general leadership in the community. So work group members are part of this larger initiative that needs to be explaining to folks why this work is important. What is it all about? I'm sure many of you get questions of, you're in all these meetings all the time. What's happening? So it's the goal of having so many people involved is that you have so many voices in the community to explain this, about why it's important, what's going on, and as well as to kind of keep things in balance about are things getting aligned, what new things are bubbling up in the community, and how can the work groups respond to that. So what are the responsibilities of the work group leaders and its members? So we usually recommend there's about 2 co-chairs who are leading this work in partnership with the backbone, as Amber described earlier. You want to really think about, for those co-chairs, first of all, who has the time to devote to this work group in a bigger way than some of the other members, and what sectors might they represent. So if you have a work group that's pretty diverse in terms of public agencies and private agencies, or it might be something that's more funder heavy, who are some important kind of voices to have in that co-chair position? So you might, and how can you balance things? So you might want to make sure that one is a public, representing the public sector, and another co-chair is representing the private sector, for example. And even more important than that is choosing people who are real servant leaders, who are going to build that trust in the group, who are going to be perceived as neutral because they're kind of leaving their ego at the door and not trying to advance their own agenda through this group, but really serving the group's greater purpose. And that they can get things done. So there's going to be to-dos in between meetings. There's going to be follow-up that needs to happen, so making sure that they're ready to do that. In terms of the other work group members, we usually say that this says about 10. I've seen this be anywhere from 10 to 20 members that are really representative of the part of the problem you're working on, and have, a very collaborative spirit. They're people you want around the table because they're willing to change. They're willing to really drive something different in the system. And again, you want to make sure that these are people who can devote the time to this effort. So sometimes the perfect person that you want around the table is not able to come to every single meeting, and it's worth having a conversation with them about who else from their organization might be able to devote the time. That's kind of on the composition, the purpose and the composition of work groups. What I'm going to talk about next is how do you come up with that framework for change and kind of select your different work groups. And choosing the both number of work groups and what parts of the problem they might focus on, this really is both an art and a science. So on the science side of things, you want to make sure that you're tackling all parts of the problem. So, for example, if you're focusing on childhood obesity, you'd obviously want to make sure you have your ground covered in terms of healthy foods, physical activity, what's happening in schools, what's happening in the general policy landscape, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really going to flow from your common agenda. That's why it's so important to spend time on that common agenda and make sure people understand the framework for change. And then the working groups is how it really comes to life. The second thing to consider under the science is make sure you understand everything that's going on. We've seen many collective impact efforts really misstep by creating a new work on, say, healthy foods when there's already a healthy food initiative or work group going on. And so what you want to do in that case is say, this is an important part of our problem. Can we either build on the work that's already happening? Is there a need for something distinct from what's already going on, and have a conversation about that so you don't get started on the wrong foot with others in the community. And then the last thing from the more scientific point of view is to think about what things are cross-cutting across all the different issue-driven or thematic focus working groups that you might have. So we always see there needs to be a data work group to stay on top of all the information in the system. You also might want to think about policy change, and so you want to have a policy work group made up of people who really like and understand the policy landscape, in addition to the topic area that you're working on. On the art side of things, this is the squishier stuff. So you need to, as Lauren mentioned earlier, where's there excitement? Where's there momentum in the system? There might be some area that you think is not the biggest area for change, but there's already momentum, so go for it. You want to make sure that you have leaders who are going to be able to head up these work groups and make sure that they're successful. And then lastly, this is the most difficult part under the art column, which is really balancing the total number of focus groups you have to be manageable for the backbone staff, quite frankly, in terms of number of meetings that they're going to, with being super inclusive or representing all parts of the problem. So that's kind of number of work groups. You'll also run into this challenge when you're thinking about number of members, that you want to be inclusive and represent all different parts of the system, but you also don't want a work group of 40 people because that won't get done. So that's where you really have to use your judgment. So next I'm going to show you how the work group structure kind of evolved for the juvenile justice work that we did in Douglas County, Nebraska, where Omaha is. And then Amber's going to talk to you in even more detail about this in a few minutes. So in Omaha, they had the third highest lockup rate of youth when we started in 2014. So there was a sense of urgency that they needed to do something different. And when we started, we said, you know what, let's get a picture of the system. And this picture that I'm showing you right now is where we landed months later. You are not meant to understand what's on here. Well, I'm trying to make a point with this slide by saying it's very complex, and not one person who works in the system every single day could draw this picture when we first started. And so we started by trying to map out what are the different parts of the system, where are there different problems arising in this picture, and what does that mean in terms of our common agenda, and more specifically, our working group structure. So where we landed was this picture of these structures, which I'll just talk about briefly. So the common agenda process took us quite a few months to make sure that all the different diverse perspectives were represented in the vision statement that you see on top here. So I won't read this to you, but essentially what was really tricky here was balancing the need for prevention of involvement with the juvenile justice system along with kind of public safety. So each and every word here was chosen carefully to reflect those two perspectives. The steering committee, as you can see on the left, was comprised of different leaders across both public and private organizations working in juvenile justice. The red bubble you see there is the youth council that I spoke about earlier. And then moving across to the right are the work groups. And so we actually had 7 work groups that I'll describe to you very briefly. The families work group I talked about earlier, which was work really trying to look at how do we empower families to better understand and be involved in the system, and how can we really make the system more family friendly. The schools group was looking again from a more prevention perspective of the school to prison pipeline, and that's the group that Amber's going to tell you a lot of detail about. We had then just a general prevention group trying to say how do we just make more supportive communities to keep kids out of the system. The case processing and equity groups, these were having to do with more actual system involvement, and we're building on existing work groups that were in the community. The data group also already existed, and we were trying to expand that beyond just kind of case processing to a broader purview. And then we also were getting started with the policy work group to look at what local and state policies needed to shift. There were a lot of community members involved as well. And you'll see their backbone staff was 3. I'm sure Amber can talk in more detail about how those roles have evolved, but it was an executive director, a program manager, which is the role that Amber serves, and then a data analyst. So those were the structures that got started in Omaha with a focus on those work groups. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about, generally what does the work of work groups look like, and then pass it back to Amber to tell you some more detail about how this all played out in Omaha. So the change that results from working groups can be really powerful, but it might not seem that way in the beginning because you have to be really patient. This takes time to build trust, and you have to be very vigilant about what are the process milestones that we're hitting before we might not get into the actual strategies. So this is the slide that you see here is just month by month what kind of unfolds in our experience of working groups. And the first 3 months are really focused on building trust among the people involved in the work group, as well as getting agreement on what are the problems that we want to tackle. The second 3 months are going to pivot to identifying solutions and prioritizing kind of those first steps that this group might take. So you're really not going to get into implementation until at least month 6, and this is pretty fast, I would say, and ambitious. And so it's really good to set these expectations with your work groups from the beginning. In terms of the types of strategies that work groups usually employ, when I started doing this work several years ago, my colleague and I would say over and over, we say to work groups, don't start new programs. You're already program rich and coordination poor, and we tell them they should be working on systems change strategies. And we realized we didn't really spell out too explicitly what we meant by that. And so we created these 5 buckets of things to guide people as they were doing their strategy development to say, does it fit into one of these 5, or even working a different way, how do we work on these 5 areas? So the first is just to better understand the current situation. Oftentimes there's a lack of data and system maps for this work, and so by kind of putting boundaries on what needs to be better understood can be really powerful. Learning by trial is probably the most programmatic, which is saying, okay, we think there's something new we want to try. Let's try it on a really small scale before we do it across, say, the county or the city. So this might be doing something like coordination, but knowing that you're going to have some explicit learning questions to make sure that you're just not launching something for the sake of launching it. Increasing coordination is probably the number one thing that work groups know they need to do, and are pretty successful at identifying some quick wins about, through these conversations you're having, how can you better coordinate things that you do every day? So always looking for opportunities to do that. Enhancing services is saying, okay, we're not going to create a new program, but we're going to beef up the things that we already have. Those are best practice that's happening in kind of a pocket of the community that we can scale up, or can we bring a best practice from outside to our community? And last is looking for policy change. And this might be policy change on a small P level, like a school policy, or it might be policy with a big P in terms of a state or local policy. So the last thing I'll talk about here before passing it over to Amber is thinking about equity and inclusion. So Lauren talked about community engagement earlier, and it's really important that the community is not just engaged at the beginning, but they're engaged throughout the work. So a lot of times community gets asked, how they want to be engaged and give feedback on the common agenda, but work groups should also make sure that they're not only engaging practitioners about what are the parts of the problem that we want to work on and how, but should also incorporate community voice. And so in those, when you're thinking about those 5 different types of strategies, how do you take into account that those who were historically left out and disproportionately affected need to be impacted by each and every one of those strategies? So with that, I will pass it back over to Amber to talk you through the next part of the Omaha story.
Okay, so thank you so much, Melissa, for asking me to speak about the collective impact work happening in Omaha, and specifically about the journey of the School-Based Arrest Task Force. As you can see on the slide in front of you, the schools group focused on different parts of the problem between juvenile justice and education. And this was a very large working group. Actually, the initial work with FSG before the Backbone staff ever came along saw a work group of almost 30 members. And there were 3 issues that really bubbled up to the top of what parts about school were impacting that juvenile justice pipeline. And they came up with the ideas of absenteeism, school-based arrests, and then school reentry as 3 major concerns for either sort of the failure or success of youth who are system involved. So what I'm going to talk about today is really just the School-Based Arrest Task Force and tell their story about how they formed as a work group, came together with some big ideas, big goals, and moved those ideas forward as a group. So the task force overarching goal is to reduce exclusionary school discipline. So when we talk about exclusionary discipline, we're talking about the incidences where youth are placed out of school as a consequence for their behavior. So use of exclusionary discipline, be it either suspension, expulsion, or arrest, does very little to correct behavior. It creates an adversarial relationship between youth and schools, and it results in a loss of instruction time. The task force provided a space for conversation between stakeholders who did not typically interact on a daily basis. So through dialogue at the task force level, the members uncovered some gaps in the system and strategized ways to address those gaps. The task force identified 2 specific concerns impacting school pushout. First, they recognized that there was a disconnect between the youth-serving systems operating within the school. So these systems that they identified were teachers, administration, school security, school resource officers, and probation. The disconnect that they often discussed was defining each person's point of view in the system was different. What they felt about the responsibilities of the other actors and what they thought about the responsibilities of their own position were very different between the actors at the table. Second, the task force recognized there was a lack of consistent and effective communication. So to address these concerns, the task force created a work plan which focused on 3 specific activities. First of all, they applied for and were accepted to the Georgetown School Justice Partnership Certificate Program. Georgetown provided an opportunity for the members of a smaller multidisciplinary team to receive intensive instruction regarding school justice partnerships from leading experts in this field. This experience was also a team-building opportunity where members of the task force became more comfortable challenging one another on issues that impacted our local jurisdiction. As part of the certificate program, the team designed a capstone project, and this pilot project focused on creating a weekly team meeting where school administrators, school resource officers, and probation officers discussed system-involved youth. So as a former school-based juvenile court officer, I was well aware of the barriers to effective communication sharing that can occur in a school environment. It was common in my former position that I would receive a call in the morning from a concerned parent. I would have the very best of intentions to share that information with an administrator or guidance counselor or whomever needed to be a part of the conversation and make a plan. However, as soon as the call ended, there would be a student at my door who needed something. I would address that student's issue, and then there would be a passing period to cover or a discipline issue to sit in on. Before I knew it, the day would be over, and the morning phone call was at the bottom of a long list of items to follow up on. The information management of hundreds, if not thousands, of students in one building is a monstrous task. This pilot was a collaboration which created a proactive and formalized process for sharing of information. The parties were tasked with building protective factors around these youth to reduce the likelihood of rearrest. It was the intentionality of the meeting that was so important. There had to be a complete pause, a dedicated space, where all members could come together and strategize with the intent of addressing the needs of individual students. As the program manager, my role was simply to provide coordination and facilitation of the project. The second activity that the task force elevated on their work plan was training and certification. Trainings were provided that specifically expanded and enhanced the awareness of each other's roles and responsibilities, increased understanding about the consequences of school exclusion and school-based arrests, increased knowledge, skills, and competencies related to school behavior management, and provided in-depth information related to adolescent brain development, trauma-informed practices, and building developmental competencies in professionals. Training began with law enforcement and expanded to school administration, teachers, and school security. When we think about school-based arrests, we immediately assume that if we train up the police officers in the school, that arrests will decline. However, it was evident early on that we could give officers the Gold Star training, yet if the administrators in the building were not on board, the power dynamic would still create an environment where an officer felt pressure to act outside of the scope of the lessons they had learned in the training. So third, and critically important to this piece of work, was policy change. Because of their participation in the work group and in the certificate program at Georgetown, law enforcement had a better understanding of the consequences of system involvement and realized that they could play a role in disrupting the number of youth who became system involved. OPD command staff communicated a directive to their school resource officers to utilize more discretion in their policing of schools. It was not an empty directive. It was supported and validated by the training that was offered to the officers. Training concepts were reinforced a culture change in policing of youth. The trainings did not take away power from the officers, rather they infused logic and reasonings. The training stressed the importance of understanding that teens are different. So, when we talk about the essential intangibles, I want to be really transparent here. This work could not or would not have occurred without the people who came to the table. It was not as simple as bringing in FSG or creating a backbone organization like Operation Youth Success. The secret sauce really is having the right people willing to come into the space and have courageous conversations about their role in this work. From high-level system folks to community-based youth-serving organizations to youth and families, each entity looked critically at where they could make small but meaningful changes which would result in better services for youth. The backbone served as a convener and provided support, but the change is the result of the members leaning in and acknowledging their agency's capacity for change. The backbone merely functions in support of this work. Without the schools, probation, police, and other system reform agents, the change could not happen. In our work, we focus on momentum. We go where the energy is. The school district was already engaged in rewriting their school discipline policy. The district had adopted utilization of restorative justice approach within the Code of Conduct discipline matrix. The task force provided a tool to the district by co-sponsoring a proposal to bring restorative justice circles into the alternative school. Task force meetings allowed for relationships and trust to be built between police, administration, probation, and community-based youth-serving organizations. As Lauren pointed out earlier, change moves at the speed of trust. These task force meetings provided the trust for those actors in the room. The task force utilized data coupled with context and lived experience. Open reflection on data also allowed the task force to discover the disconnects. The pilot project focused on changing the behavior of system actors, not the youth. This strategy placed ownership for change squarely on the adults working in the system, rather than blaming youth and families. The teaming and training focused on viewing youth's behavior differently. Administrators, law enforcement, and probation began to change their frame when looking at school behavior. Professionals began looking at the youth's behavior and asking not, what is wrong with you, but rather, what happened to you and what is my role in helping? Adults became responsible for building supports around youth to reduce school exclusion. There was a culture shift, particularly for school administrators and law enforcement. Energy with this work group was moving fast. The backbone support staff assisted by aligning resources and managing logistics. The Deputy Chief of Police was an unlikely leader for this work, as law enforcement was very tentative at first. However, through continued relationship building, law enforcement became a champion for these efforts. Other members of the community acknowledged the police buy-in, which legitimizes the approach. Improved collaboration between the school justice partners is a system-level response. It reduces the frequency of discretionary school-based arrests. It links youth at risk of arrest to appropriate school and community-based services and supports, and it builds knowledge and skills among teachers, school staff, and school resource officers to recognize and manage behavior in the school and access the needed community services. So now we're on to worksheet 2. Yeah.
Great. So what we're going to do is take about 5 minutes to flip to pages 2 and 3 of your worksheet. You'll see that we're asking you to think about a specific strategy for one of your working groups or potential working groups, and kind of write down what is it, who would be involved, what would you expect to see kind of results from that strategy, and how would you ensure that it's going to be systems changing and not just another new program. So that's page 2, and on page 3, we'll go back to that community engagement spectrum to talk about how would you ensure that you're engaging community members in the strategy development process. So we know that this is a lot. We're just going to give you 5 minutes to get started. We're not going to spend too much time here, so we still have about 15 minutes for open Q&A before we wrap up. So you'll hear some music again, and we'll check back in about 5. Hi, everyone. This is just a 1-minute warning to wrap up what you're doing. And again, don't feel pressured that you have to fill this all out. We hope you use it as a tool with others after, but we'll just give you 30 seconds to a minute to wrap up, and then we'll pivot into the Q&A. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Robert, I know you've been monitoring some of the Q&A. Do you want to share some of the things that were coming up?
Sure, and thanks again, everyone, for asking your questions. We're going to try and get through as many as possible, and forgive me for trying to cluster some of them into a combined question. So we had two folks in Connecticut, Diana and Katika, who both asked a similar question about on the community engagement thread. So what are some best practices for working with communities that have become used to not having a voice or have been marginalized, and a related question about how you keep different stakeholders involved when they fail to see themselves in the shared work. So I think a common thread here around kind of what do you do when you might have some reluctance among key aspects of the community to engage.
Thank you, Robert. Those are great questions and really very pertinent and hard to address, or can be hard to address. I think the first thing I would say is that acknowledging the history of what that unique community. So, using the Omaha example, and I don't know if this was the case, but if there had been, for example, other efforts to do this that hadn't worked out well, then to sort of come in and sort of ignore or try to paper over that there'd been hard feelings or real issues there would be a misstep. So acknowledging what has come before, what didn't work well, and being really upfront and frank about that, and opening the dialogue, saying, "Hey, we want to do things differently, and this is how we're going to approach it, and we want to, be in partnership and hear from you if you're not feeling like it's going differently." So I think, starting from a place of humility, frankly, and recognizing that there's undoubtedly a history and acknowledging that you can't necessarily change that, but that you want to have a different approach going forward. So that would be one thing. I think being sure that there is adequate community members as parts so that, everyone can hold each other accountable, and not just in sort of a tokenistic way, but in an authentic way, and that it includes folks who might not otherwise be identified for this, and this means you might need to go to some unusual places, go to barbershops or laundromats or beauty shops or churches or other places or social groups, places where you might need a neighbor. You're going to probably need some neighborhood champions or community kind of interpreters to sort of open some of those relationships and encourage participation. But I'll stop there. I'm sure Melissa and Amber have ideas as well.
Yeah, Lauren, I think that you're exactly right. I think that it is absolutely true that you cannot overcome what you do not address. And so you're right on target with some of the approaches that we're learning that we need to take in Omaha, reaching out to neighborhood groups, embedding ourselves in existing organizations that we have here in Omaha that are doing a really good job at community engagement. Melissa alluded earlier to the fact that there's a lot of times when you don't need to reinvent the wheel. So as we began doing this work and have been doing it for almost a little over 2 years now, we had to learn who were those members of the community that could assist us in partnering, where we need to partner so that we can listen to and understand the voices of the people who do feel marginalized, because there's a lot of people, particularly in justice work, who feel very marginalized, and there needs to be a lot of humility in our system and acceptance of youth voice and family voice. It's critically important, and I give all the props in the world to the other folks in this community who are doing this very difficult work. And Melissa, I don't know if you have anything to add from the historical perspective of the work in Omaha, but I do think that community engagement cannot be an afterthought. That would be my perspective.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that, it's whenever we've done community engagement, people are so grateful for being asked and included, especially if it's just not the consultants or not the backbones, but if it is those, leaders who they have felt marginalized by in the past, engaging directly with them, asking them, including them in creating those solutions, that activity itself is just so powerful. So I would encourage all of you to think about how do you open up that kind of dialogue amongst different folks.
And then just quickly to build on that, and I think Amber was underneath what you were saying, is that, people are really good at detecting sham versus authentic sort of energy. So, and by that I mean, like, if it's a kind of maybe not on purpose a sham thing, but, really not coming from a place of authentic humility and desire for engagement, they're going to know that, right? Because there's not going to be enough chairs for them to sit. It's going to be held in a place they can't get to by public transportation. There's not going to be childcare or assistance with transportation. So there's lots of ways that, you could build it to be have the semblance of community engagement, but in actuality, you're not really, deeply thinking about it. What would it take to really value and respect all members? So I'll stop there.
Thank you all for weighing in on that. I've got a couple questions I want to get to that are on a different thread, more on the kind of nuts and bolts of working groups and steering committees. But let me ask one quick follow-up question that came through on this thread about kind of community engagement and equity and power. Just any reflections, maybe Amber, you could weigh in, or Melissa, from what you saw too in Omaha, on how you use just very direct language in calling out some of the quote-unquote elephant in the room challenges that might relate to, inequitable outcomes for youth. Just how did you dig in on that? Someone asked a question about how you make sure you maintain credibility and really get at being clear and honest about the problems that might be and the disparities that might be in a community. So any tips on how you waded into what can often be difficult conversations but needed conversations?
Sure. I think one of the things that we're very fortunate to have in terms of our collective impact work here with juvenile justice system reform was there was already an existing sort of platform through JDAI, or the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, going on in Omaha. So there was already, a disproportionate minority contact work group which was addressing issues of equity in our juvenile justice system. And so we, work in that space together with that work group. The JDAI initiative, their whole deal is to reduce the unnecessary incarceration of youth, and we cannot do the work that we do without them as partners. So we lean on them very heavily in terms of the racial equity lens that they provide the work that is happening in Omaha. And then additional to that, we have some very active groups, neighborhood groups in the community, and the Empowerment Network in North Omaha that really on a very regular, weekly basis brings the community together to talk about justice and justice reform and doing better for folks who have been marginalized. So, I'll stop with that, but I will say there were some really fantastic existing partners out there, and we learn from them. We learn from them every day on how to keep this work moving.
Great. Thanks for that. I'm going to switch gears now and cover a couple, and again, try to cluster some of these questions. There was several questions that came in around working group momentum and communication across working group partners. So maybe, Amber, you could start on this one, or Melissa or Lauren, feel free to jump in too. Just any tips on how to maintain and increase momentum, how to communicate among working group participants, and just, specifics on how you set expectations. There were several questions along that thread. And maybe, Amber, when you jump in on this one, if you could also just clarify the 3 backbone staff that were working on your collaborative, are they all working 100% of their time on the Collective Impact Initiative, or are they working on other things? So you can maybe speak to that as you respond.
I'll start with that, actually. That's the easiest to answer. The 3 staff, the backbone staff that were mentioned in the slide deck, are full-time dedicated staff to the project. We actually have added additional staff. We have grown a lot. We've taken on a lot of responsibilities that were not sort of on our plate when this initiative was originally conceived. So we do have an executive director, myself. We have a data analyst. We also have a program coordinator and a full-time administrative assistant. It sounds like a pretty large group of folks, but when you consider the volume of participants in this reform effort, we stay extremely busy. So that's the answer to that question. In terms of increasing momentum of the work groups, I do believe that we have definitely had an ebb and flow in each work group. We have certain times where it feels like we're accomplishing very mighty things at a very quick pace, and then we have other work group meetings where we seem to be sort of chugging along. But I think that's when, we get together with our co-chairs as staff, and we try to think of very interactive exercises. We try to brainstorm, where do we want to get, what is the next step in this process, and what is something where we can make sure everybody is participating in the conversation, because what we see on feedback after group meetings is that people feel meetings go best when they have very high participation. So we make sure that we keep our meetings interactive. We don't want to have backbone staff or co-chairs just talking at the work group members. We try to very much keep them engaged in the conversation, so it has to be very interactive. I think that's one tip for any new group that's starting off, is to really try to increase opportunities for direct engagement.
Great. Thanks for sharing. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. I need just 30, 45 seconds at the end to wrap up. So let's try and get 2 more questions in. There were 2 questions that came in related about kind of size and frequency of steering committee meetings. So maybe Melissa, you or Lauren could take this one. Just any guidance on the appropriate size of a steering committee and whether quarterly is the right frequency or more frequently. Just talk a little bit about what you see in the appropriate size and then kind of frequency of steering committee meetings.
I can start with that, and I'd love an update, Amber. So when we started the steering committee in Omaha, the planning group, who were kind of the champions for it, was a group of about 8. And in our first meeting, we said, who are all the people we need to have the full system in the room? And so that was our first mini steering committee meeting, was we brainstormed that. And I think we got up to about 20 total, folks. And then we were meeting monthly at that point. And we were probably maybe 3 to 6 months in, probably 3 to 4 months in, and we realized there were some missing perspectives around the table. So I do think we added about 2 or 3 more. So we had about between 22 and 24 when FSG left at a kind of the 1-year mark. They were still meeting monthly, and that's normally what we recommend, is kind of monthly meetings, especially for the first year. After that, we've seen it drop down to maybe every other month or quarterly. But Amber, would be great to hear kind of the evolution now in kind of year 2 to 3. What's the total size and frequency of meetings?
Yeah, we really do maintain about that 20-ish, low 20 number. We've had a few folks who have left the work for various reasons, retirement, new jobs. but we have brought on some replacements for those folks. We've also tried to increase, the cultural competency of the group because we see that as an issue. We want to make sure that the composition of the committee is more reflective of the population that we're serving. So we're very cognizant of that. And the committee continues to meet monthly. I think we find that some months we would love to take a break, but the work just moves too quickly to be able to take a break.
That makes a lot of sense. I know we're at time, unfortunately. I'm going to take the last question just because I can keep it on the clock while I give an answer here. There was a question that came in about how can you update the frameworks to indicate that this work is not linear and that it's more iterative. And it actually, that's come up a lot in conversations we've seen that, this is not just step A, step B, step C, that there actually will be more discussion on that question in our next webinar actually on sustaining momentum and collective impact, where we're going to talk through this helpful framework called the eco-cycle. So more to come on that. You can Google eco-cycle framework and see more about it, but you'll get a chance to learn more in November. So we're at time, so let me just real quickly take 30 seconds to thank, first of all, Melissa, Amber, and Lauren for your perspectives and participating on the webinar today. We just really appreciate your expertise. And just as I was saying, please mark your calendar if you haven't yet registered for the Sustaining Collective Impact online training on November 13th, and then our last one in this series on using data for a collective impact refresh. If you can join us for those. The last thing I'll say is you can find today's PowerPoint slides and worksheet on collectiveimpactforum.org, and please do create an online profile there if you haven't yet to access other resources. And then lastly, we'll ask you to take a moment to complete the evaluation that will appear on your screen, and your comments and suggestions are really important to us as they help us adjust our programming to fit your needs. So thanks everyone for your time today, for your great questions, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a great day.